Shalom uvracha, muadim l'simcha. It is Thursday morning, Chol HaMoed Sukkot. I'm here in one of the teachers' rooms at SAR. I dropped off my son who has goes to the elementary school, the academy, and I'm doing a little bit of catch up here in the high school and doing some learning and preparing. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to share my Dvar Torah from here this morning. I hope everyone's having a wonderful Sukkot within the limitations that we all face, and continued bracha for everyone in terms of health, and also just encouraging everyone to continue, even though that there have been unfortunately some people who've pushed back, and I believe also have made some irresponsible statements about pulling back on the restrictions or the guidelines that we as a community have adopted in our schools and in our shuls and our communities, which has kept the virus low, the virus positivity in our area low. There are those who have been more lax, and again, I want to encourage everyone, for the sake of all of us and for the sake of our children and the ability to have school in person and all the other things, please make sure as much as possible to ensure whatever gatherings are socially distant, they're small, that they have masks, people are masked, and everything that's important to ensure our continued safety. Simchat Torah, Plan B. What do I mean by that? Not just this year because of the coronavirus. Simchat Torah, in its essence, is a holiday of Plan B. What do I mean by that? We know if we look in the Torah describes Sukkot as a 7-day holiday, followed by an 8th day. And in the Torah, the 8th day is a totally separate holiday from the other 7 days. 7 days you sit in the Sukkah, and the 8th day you don't sit in the Sukkah. And in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, that is the standard practice. They sit in the Sukkah for 7 days, and the 8th day, they don't sit in the Sukkah. The problem is that we live in the diaspora, and we have the second day of Yom Tov, and so we're not, quote-unquote, sure whether the 7th day is really the 7th day or it's also the 8th day. And so we, according to Talmudic law, we're supposed to sit in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeret, and then, but not make a bracha because we're not sure. We don't make the Leishay Basukah. We're not sure, is it really Sukkot? Is it a new holiday? And so we kind of compromise. We don't take the lulav and etrog, but we sit in the sukkah. We sit in the sukkah, but we don't make a bracha. And so according to Torah, according to the Bible, that's it. 8 days, we're back to work. But we, of course, have a 9th day. And the 9th day is not a Sukkot in any way. We don't sit in the sukkah. We don't even sit in the sukkah without a bracha. It's the second day of the 8th day. It's a safek of Shmini Atzeret. And we know that if you look in the Talmud originally, there was no minhag of Simchat Torah. In fact, in Eretz Yisrael, they read the Torah on a triennial cycle, and they finished every 3 years, not every year. There was no special Simchat Torah. In fact, it was just the second day of Yom Tov. In fact, that's what the Gemara calls it. Yom Tov Sheni Shel Acharon Shel Sukkot Shel Chag, the last day of Sukkot, second day. At a certain point, the Babylonian Masoret, Babylonian tradition of finishing the Torah in 1 year became normative throughout the Jewish diaspora. And with it, in Gaonic times, developed a concept of Simchat Torah, and many customs developed in the Middle Ages. And of course, what's fascinating is that with the adoption of those customs, they were then brought back to Eretz Yisrael when Jews started returning in the Middle Ages in small numbers. And then in the modern period, all the minhagim of all the communities of Simchas Torah were then put into Shmini Atzeres. And so you have this very weird reality, if you've ever been to Israel and Shmini Atzeret, that you're saying Tfilat Geshem and Yizkor, and 2 minutes later you're dancing with Torah. And there's a real sense of anomaly and a sense of what's going on is a kind of dichotomy, very dichotomous feelings and it's a very long davening of Shmini Atzeret, especially if they also would read Kohelet. This year we're reading Kohelet on Zoom. There is no Kohelet in person, but we're going to be reading Kohelet on Zoom. But Simchas Torah is really a Plan B holiday. What do I mean by that? If you look at the essence of Simchas Torah, the customs that arose around it, hakafot. It's a strange custom. Where does it come from? So it's very clear. It comes from, there is a concept of hakafot in the Talmudic literature, not by Simchas Torah. They didn't know of hakafot on Simchat Torah, but there were hakafot on Sukkot. The Torah, the Mishnah, says explicitly that once a day in the Beit HaMikdash, they would circle the Mizbeach with the lulav and etrog, which is what we call Hoshanot, which we do every day of Sukkot. And then on the seventh day was the Hoshana Rabbah, was the great day where they circled the Mizbeach, they circled the altar 7 times. So hakafot fundamentally are rooted in, have nothing to do with the Torah per se, they're rooted in the Mikdash, of the experience of coming to the Beit HaMikdash, taking the lulav and etrog, which represents the fruits and the foliage of Eretz Yisrael, surrounding, in a sense of simcha, going around the altar and experiencing God's presence. As the Mishnah talks about, Anu liyah, ve'inenu liyah, we look to God, we experience the simcha. The Torah says, V'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, you will be joyous in front of God in the Beit HaMikdash. But what do you do when there is no Beit HaMikdash? What do you do when your mode of simcha has been taken away from you? Where your essence, your essential way of celebration has been cut off? Where your Judaism, which has been temple-centered, is now cast adrift. And so the rabbis, as we know, the famous, what we call today the Yavne moment, pivoted and created a holiday and created a Judaism which was much more prayer-centered, much more Talmud Torah-centered, study of Torah-centered, mitzvot-centered, home-centered. When there's no longer a mikdash, the mikdash ma'at is the synagogue and the home. And the rabbis, the Gaonic rabbis who created the hakafot, what they basically did was they transposed and said, if we can't encounter God directly in the temple, if we don't have a Beit HaMikdash and we don't have Shekhinah amongst us, we will encounter God in the Plan B, the place where there is no prophecy anymore and there is no Shekhinah, but there is Torah. The one thing that's left for us is to rejoice in His Word if we can't rejoice explicitly in God's presence. We rejoice in the Word of God, in the study of God's words, in His direction, even if we can't rejoice in God's imminent presence as it was in the Mikdash. And so, conceptually, Simchas Torah is a plan B. It's a statement that we are not living an ideal, and yet we still try to find ways to connect to God. We transpose the Mikdash experience, the temple experience, to our Torah experience, and we dance and sing with the Torah and look for the chavaya, the experience of Torah, rather than purely the intellectual, cognitive experience. And then this year we're in the Plan C mode. We don't even have, and that's because of the terrible virus, we don't have the opportunity to do the regular Plan B of connecting with wild singing and dancing. But that's also okay. We have to find Plan C. We have to find ways of connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and being misameach in our lot of Torah, even if we can't do it exactly the way we've done it before. We need to pivot and get involved. It reminds me of a story I once heard from Moriv Rabbi Rav Yehuda Amital, Zichrono Livracha. Rav Amital mentioned that he once spoke to a group of Jews from German origin, Yekis, as we say, who rhapsodized about their experience of Simchas Torah. What was their experience? In this Yeki community that they were recounting, the people would practice on Simchas Torah the Hakafot, because for them the Simcha was that everybody was in place. There was no wild dancing. It was an orderly, maybe even socially distant circle, one or two circles around the Torah with a sense of dignity and a sense of calm, not the wild dancing that we're used to from our experience, from school and from shul and from chatunot and from weddings and shabbatonim. They had a different tradition. Simcha can be experienced in different ways: the order, the calm, the quiet. This year, we're going to be Yekis. This year, our Simchas Torah, we have to find ways of finding that Simcha in the connection of the small, still voice, not the shofar gadol, but the kol dmama daka, the orderly hakafot without too much singing and without too much dancing, and maybe a little bit more words of Torah. That's what we're looking to do. That's what we're looking to do and to experience. And just as Simchas Torah in its essence is a plan B, this is going to be a plan C, and we can all hopefully have a meaningful and wonderful Simchat Torah, Shmini Atzeret, within the constraints that we find ourselves in, and make the most meaningful experience. As of course many have mentioned over the course of these months, the great work of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. In the end, it's always about how we react to the situations that we're put into. A human being, even if they take away everything, the human being has the choice how, where, and in what direction we will take what's given to us and make it meaningful. I wish everybody a great Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. I want to thank all those who worked so hard on behalf of the shul and all the volunteers throughout the course of the Yamim Noraim. And Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.